Before World War II, a lot of parts of the world were colonies and were controlled by big nations such as France, Germany, USA, and others. Vietnam wasn't an exception of a colony, and it was a country controlled by France. But as the World War II started, and France was busy with fighting and problems in Europe, Japan decided to come in and invade Vietnam and the whole of Indochina. Viet Minh was a national communist party organized in 1941 in Vietnam. Its leader was to happen to be Ho Chi Minh. America helped Prime Minister Diem to become the president of South Vietnam because the CIA were looking after him and thought that he would be a big capitalist success to fight against communism in North Vietnam. At first, Diem was a good president by building new schools and helping the economy. However, the number of people who didn't like him grew. Since Diem was a Catholic, he didn't agree with the Buddhists, so they became oppressed since he ignored them. Also, Diem threw many political opponents into prison camps where they were tortured and killed. By 1959, over half the country was against him. Domino theory was an idea by USA that if one country falls communism, all the other countries around her will fall communism. So, USA sent trained troops to Vietnam in order to save the country of becoming communist. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is the event that made the United States declare war against North Vietnam. In 1964, a torpedo by North Vietnamese hit an American destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin forces. 2 days later, the ship reported that it was hit a second time by a torpedo. President Johnson, on the other side, used these events as an excuse to allow American troops to be sent to engage in war against North Vietnam. In response to the Gulf of Tonkin incident of August 2nd and 4th, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson, per the authority given to him by Congress in the subsequent Gulf of Tonkin resolution, decided to escalate the Vietnam conflict by sending U.S. ground troops to Vietnam. On March 8, 1965, 3,500 U.S. Marines landed near Da Nang in South Vietnam. They're the first U.S. troops to arrive in Vietnam.
The Americans regularly bombed North Vietnam. More bombs were dropped on North Vietnam than on Germany in World War II. The American tactics brought little success. The U.S. forces had the technology to win a straightforward battle between towns or massed infantry. However, the Viet Cong soldiers refused to fight this kind of war. They used sabotage and sudden ambushes. The Americans used massive air power to try to bomb supply lines, chemical defoliants to destroy areas of the countryside where communist soldiers might be hiding. These tactics didn't work, as they only angered the Viet Cong soldiers. What happened at My Lai? On March 16, 1968, American soldiers massacred the villagers of a place in Vietnam called My Lai. The American officer, Lieutenant William Calley, afterwards was court-martialed for the murder of 109 civilians. This story of what happened at My Lai horrified many Americans and changed their opinions about America being the savior of the world. This incident showed that America was no longer the maker of peace and that it was the aggressor. One of the main questions is why did many Americans not support the war? Well, most Americans in the 1950s and early 1960s supported the war in Vietnam and thought that the world should be saved from communism. However, many young people that were born in the baby boom didn't share the same views as their parents, as they were turning 20 years old at the time the war had started. There was a major increase in draft. The incident in My Lai changed the views of the American people about the war. This war became harder to justify when it was costing the lives of so many young men. By 1968, 300 Americans were dying every week, reaching a total of over 50,000. The war itself had cost $30 billion by 1968, preventing promised reforms in the USA from taking place. There were highly toxic chemicals being used to destroy the jungle that were also poisoning the people and that are still there in the atmosphere till this day, causing deaths and birth defects. The terrible photos and documented videos that were sent straight from the American journalist working in Vietnam back home to the US also provided massive opposition towards the war, as millions of Americans saw it as immoral and demoralizing. In 1968, Nixon became president, as LBJ gave up the fight and failed to be president. Richard Nixon soon decided that American troops should get out of Vietnam and finish the war. The price that Americans had to pay was too much for them to continue fighting. People soon realized that there was no point. 55,000 American soldiers were dead, and billions of dollars were spent on the war. This was destroying not only the lives of American people and families, as well as the Vietnamese people's lives, but also the American economy. The Americans had lost the confidence in their mission as the world's leading nation. President Nixon tried using Vietnamization, which was a policy reducing American troops and trying to strengthen the forces of South Vietnam. Nixon placed much more of the burden of fighting on the South Vietnamese people. This policy never worked in the end, so it wasn't a success that President Nixon was hoping for. Xuan Thuy was a North Vietnamese political figure. He was the foreign minister of North Vietnam from 1963 to 1965 and the chief negotiator of the North Vietnamese at the Paris peace talks, which ended the Vietnam War in 1973. At the time the war ended, President Nixon appointed Henry Cabot Lodge, the chief American negotiator to the Paris talks, to end the war in Vietnam. Unfortunately, this didn't have effect in fostering more meaningful negotiations.
You were never sure who your enemy was over there. By day, people would work on our military bases, fighting the South Vietnamese army, and by night they would fight for the Viet Cong, laying mines, committing sabotage, and murdering individual American and Vietnamese soldiers, as well as anyone who openly supported the cause of the South Vietnamese government.